If you ask as a tourist in Berlin-Schöneberg about Keithstraße, you'll either get the answer, Keithstraße, never heard of it, or that's in Langwitz. But in fact, no one was looking for Keithstraße spelled with two S's, but rather for Keithstraße, named after the Scotsman James Keith, with a taut at the end. But real Berliners only know Keithstraße. So, who was this Keith, alias Keat? He was born James Francis Edward Keith on the 11th of June, 1696, at Inverugie Castle near Peterhead, the second son of Mary Drummond and William Keith. His father, the 9th Earl Marshal of Scotland, was a Knight of the Order of the Thistle and a member of the Privy Council of James Francis Stuart, known as the Old Pretender. James's parents were staunch Jacobites, like the English, Scottish, and Irish supporters of the pretender to the throne living in exile. They named their second-born son after the pretender, as someone who claims a throne but is not officially recognized as a monarch. James and his older brother George were then raised by a relative, the historian and Bishop Robert Keith. After that, James spent a short time at King's College in Aberdeen, then at the University of Edinburgh, where he prepared for a career as a lawyer. Here, however, he also developed a keen interest in literature, which would later earn him the esteem of Europe's most eminent scholars. And it was in Edinburgh that he first became interested in Freemasonry, which was to accompany him throughout his life. For example, on the 11th of December, 1756, in the Grosse Merkerstrasse in Halle an der Saale as provincial master, he established the Philadelphia Lodge of the Three Golden Arms, which has been known as the Lodge of the Three Swords since 1756. But as can also be read in his unfinished autobiography, he was dissatisfied with the conditions in Great Britain. This had begun when Queen Anne, the last monarch of the House of Stuart, had failed to arrange her succession in favor of her not very popular half-brother James. When she died at only 49 years old without any living descendants, Georg Ludwig, Duke of Brunswick-Luneburg, was crowned King George I, which, however, led to an explosive mood in Scotland. Because with his appointment, the rule of the House of Stuart had ended and passed on to the newly established House of Hanover, the House of Hanover. The appointment of George also triggered the first Jacobite uprising, known as the 15, with the intention of proclaiming the Old Pretender, James Francis Edward Stuart, as King of Scotland. Both Keith brothers joined the rebellion as soldiers and also fought in the Battle of Sheriff Moor in central Scotland on the 13th of November, 1715. The Jacobites were led by the nervous Colonel John Erskine, the 23rd Earl of Mar, who ended the battle too early and thus greatly contributed to the demoralization of the Jacobite army and the failure of their uprising. Another reason was that on December 15, 1715, shortly after the Battle of Sheriff Moor, the Old Pretender Stuart landed at Peterhead on a fishing boat, but instead of the hoped-for reinforcements, he had brought only 2 servants with him. Then Stuart fell ill, spent the winter at Scone Palace, and on the 5th of February 1716 he left again, since after the dilemma only a few Scots had supported him. As for the Keith brothers, who had been pursued by government troops almost to the Isle of Skye, they had embarked on a French warship with another 100 Scottish fighters and had been taken to Saint-Paul-de-Léon in Brittany, where they had to remain for the time being because of their participation in the Jacobite uprising. James then went to Paris, where he had relatives. By selling some of the items he had brought with him, he had been able to survive, though just barely, and his pride had forbidden him from asking his relatives for help. In his memoirs, he blamed a mixture of insecurity and vanity for this. Finally, the pretender's mother, Marie Beatrice d'Este, Princess of Modena, who was also living in exile in France, sent him 1,000 livres, livre for pounds, a silver currency, which enabled Keith, with a little help from his parents, to continue his university studies for the rest of the year. In Paris in June 1717, he had also met Peter I of Russia, who was visiting Western Europe at the time, and had been appointed a member of the Academy of Sciences in December. And since Keith had decided to leave the academy and enter the military, he offered his military services to the Tsar, who did not accept them. The Keith brothers then traveled incognito to Spain, and, despite their initial failed uprising, succeeded in placing James Francis Edward Stuart, who was living in exile, on the throne of Great Britain. At that time, Spain had supported these efforts. In Madrid, the two had collected money from sympathizers of the Jacobite movement to buy a frigate. However, Keith had noticed during talks with these protagonists in both Spain and France that the supposed supporters of James Stuart were anything but united, and, as Keith suspected, more or less all pursued their own selfish plans. It was precisely these experiences during the Jacobite uprisings and his observations of the rivalry among the Scottish clan chiefs that had already shown him early on the pitfalls of military command, the art of negotiation, and the importance of listening and diplomacy. Once all the preparations for a new uprising had been completed, the Jacobites set sail for Scotland on a small ship on the 19th of March, 1719. But by this time, the government in London had already been informed of the Jacobites' plans and had prepared for them militarily. The conspirators had originally planned to land 5,000 Spanish soldiers in the southwest of England, in addition to their own efforts, while another expeditionary army under the command of Charles XII of Sweden was to land in Scotland, and Scottish Jacobites were to capture the port of Inverness. But when Charles was killed during his second campaign in Norway in November 1718 at the age of 36, Swedish involvement, and with it, the planned Scottish operation, had largely come to an end. But the ongoing disputes among the Scottish clan chiefs had also complicated the situation. As always with such undertakings, this time it was also about who should take command. At first, Keith's brother George, now a major general, was designated as the commander. But then William Murray, Marquis of Tullibardine Murray, pointed out his higher rank as lieutenant general and was appointed as the leader. Fortunately, James had learned through intermediaries that the government troops knew about the landing site the Scots had in mind, and he was also able to convince Murray to disembark the Jacobite fighters and send the Spanish ships back home, since their confiscation by the English could endanger the Jacobite relations with Spain. Nevertheless, by the end of March 1719, under the leadership of James Keith's brother George, 300 Spanish Marines and around 1,000 Jacobite exiles had landed at Oilendonen Castle. But on their advance toward Inverness, they were intercepted by English troops in the western Scottish Highlands, and on the 10th of June, they were defeated in the Battle of Glen Shiel, which brought the uprising in Scotland to a final end. Both sides had around 100 dead or wounded, which is commemorated today by a monument. However, this defeat also led the leaders of the Jacobites to realize that this failed uprising had so severely undermined the Stuart cause that there was no real prospect of success anymore. In the following years, high-ranking exiles were pardoned by the English and returned to Scotland. James and George Keith had also now given up their active involvement in the Jacobite conspiracies. To evade the search parties of the government troops, they had hidden in the Highlands for several months until they were able to set sail for Holland from Peterhead in early September 1719. However, when they attempted to cross France to reach Spain, they were arrested in Sedan and imprisoned. However, since the French gendarmes only saw them as illegal border crossers, and no one had asked for their names, they were released after a short time and happily made it to Spain. There, as you can read, James Keith had become a lieutenant colonel in the Irish Brigade under the Spanish Army in the 2nd Regiment of Duke James Butler, 2nd Duke of Ormond. However, the official Irish Brigade was a brigade established in 1690 of the French Army, which was disbanded after the French Revolution in 1789, and not the unit of Irish soldiers in Spain that had existed since 1709 as the Regimiento Hibernia. For Butler, the 2nd Duke of Ormond had gone to Madrid in November 1718, where he became a general in the Spanish army, and where Keith then served under him. He was then involved in the failed siege of Gibraltar from February 11th to June 12th, 1727, during the Anglo-Spanish War, which lasted until November 9th, 1729. But then his Protestantism increasingly hindered his further advancement in Catholic Spain. And since he had refused to convert to Catholicism in 1728, the Spanish king, Philip V, recommended him to Tsar Peter II of Russia, who had been ruling since that year, and welcomed the 32-year-old staff officer Keith with open arms. In the Imperial Russian Army, he was initially a regimental commander in the brigade of Marshal Vasily Vladimirovich Dolgorukov, but then he requested a 3-month leave to learn the Russian language and the different tactics. On this occasion, he was also able to further refine the experience he had gained in dealing with the clan chiefs, while observing the intrigues at the Russian court. His first mentor in Russia was James Francis Fitzjames Stuart, 2nd Duke of Berwick. He had fought in Spain as a colonel of the Irish regiments, then became a lieutenant general in the Spanish Royal Army, and in February 1724, a field marshal. From December 1726 to 1730, he then served as the Spanish ambassador to Russia under Tsar Peter II until Peter died of smallpox in 1730 and was succeeded by Anna, who would then rule as empress for 10 years. The commander of the Keiths in Russia was Peter, Earl of Lacy, now Pyotr Petrovich Lacy, one of the most successful foreign field marshals in Russian service. Lacy had fled from Ireland after the Williamite War, which lasted from 1688 to 1691. This war, also called the War of the Two Kings, had taken place between the Dutch William III, also known as William of Orange, and the already mentioned James II from Ireland. As for the unmarried Keith, he was one of the first Freemasons active in Russia, in the capital city of St. Petersburg. From 1732 to 1734, he was the worshipful master, that is, the chairman of the local Masonic lodge. In 1734, at the age of 38, he was appointed lieutenant general. A year later, he took part in the Russo-Turkish War as adjutant general to the Tsar, and was seriously wounded during the storming of the fortress of the Ukrainian Black Sea, port city of Ochakiv, as a member of the army of Field Marshal Burkhard Christoph Graf von Munich, who was born in Neuenhuntorf in Oldenburg and served in the Russian army. This city also became famous through the fantastic tale of Hieronymus Karl Friedrich Baron von Munchausen, known as the Lying Baron, who supposedly flew directly into the fortress occupied by the Turks on a cannonball. During this time, Keith enjoyed the special favor of Empress Anna, who appointed him General of the Infantry and honored him several times, including with the Imperial Order of St. Andrew. In 1740, his patroness died of a kidney stone and was succeeded in 1741 by Empress Elizabeth I, who, through a bloodless coup against the one-year-old Ivan VI, who had been made ruler after Anna's death, had come to power. During the Russian-Swedish War of 1741 to 43, also known as the War of the Hats, in which the Swedish Hat Party attempted to reverse their country's defeat, suffered 20 years earlier in the Great Northern War against Russia, and to at least partially restore their own position as a great power, General Keith on the 3rd September 1741, in the Battle of Wilmenstrand. Afterwards, he was appointed by Elizabeth, whose coup d'etat had been actively supported by Keith, as governor of Finland, which had previously been integrated into the Swedish administration until the end of 1742, and proved himself to be a capable and liberal civil administrator. But to escape the intrigues of Elizabeth's chancellor, Alexei Petrovich Bestuzhev-Ryumin, who had significantly influenced Russian foreign policy for 20 years, and, in particular, its relations with its allies and opponents, especially Prussia and France, Keith requested his dismissal from Imperial Russian service after 17 years of Russian service, which was granted in July 1747. After he had turned to Frederick the Great, something unique happened in the history of the Brandenburg Prussian army. The 51-year-old Russian general of infantry of Scottish descent, James Keith, was taken directly into the Prussian army by Old Fritz as a field marshal without any detour. However, Friedrich's adjutant general, Major General Hans Karl von Winterfeldt, had also played a role in the background. He had managed to persuade several capable officers from the Imperial Russian Army to transfer to the Prussian army, including James Keith, who then became Jakob von Kite in Berlin. From now on, as a Berliner, I will refer to him that way. However, the newly appointed field marshals suffered greatly from the Berlin weather in the first years and often had to stay in bed. In 1749, the highly educated Scot was awarded the Order of the Black Eagle by Frederick the Great and appointed governor of Berlin. He was often a guest at the King's Round Table in the Marble Hall of Sanssouci Palace, and was also honored with membership in the Prussian Academy of Sciences. Speaking of the Academy of Sciences, his brother George, who had moved to Prussia in 1747, was also a member. He maintained just as friendly a relationship with Frederick the Great as his brother did. When George also fought as an officer on the Russian side in the Russo-Turkish War, just like his brother James, he adopted the 12-year-old daughter of the Turkish commander of the Janissaries, Mehmet Ula, after the siege of Ochakov in 1737. In 1763, she was baptized as a Christian with the name Marie Emete and later married the French Huguenot and officer Denise Danielle de Fremont. However, the marriage was divorced after 2 years, and George's adopted daughter Marie Emete then lived with him until his death in 1778 at Keithstraße 9 in Potsdam. His brother James had, over time, become one of the most important allies and friends of Frederick II. He had created a life-size chess set for him and accompanied the king on his incognito journeys through Germany and Hungary. In contrast to his father, William Keith, who was described as very wild, fickle, and passionate, Keith showed calmness and composure even in difficult situations, which may also have been due to a young lady named Eva Merthin, whom the 47-year-old Keith met as governor of Finland in 1741, at a gathering hosted by Russian officers. Eva was born in 1723 in Turku, as one of 8 children of the merchant, later mayor, Karl Merthin. Her paternal grandfather and his father had been merchants in Turku, with the latter probably originating from Lübeck. She was educated, multilingual, and had Scottish roots on her mother's side, which connected her to Keith. Later, it was said that her influence on him contributed to the mild occupation policy in Finland. After her father passed away shortly before the peace agreement on March 31st, 1743, and Keith was the Russian ambassador in Stockholm for a while, she followed him as his companion. Even though the two were neither married in church nor civilly, Eva, who had several children with Keith, was regarded by both him and society as his official and lawful wife. After Keith's death in 1759 or 60, Eva married Johann David von Reichenbach, a scientist 9 years her junior and the chief financial officer in Swedish Pomerania in Stralsund. Eva lived with him in Stralsund until his death in 1807. She herself, the main character of the novel, The Duchess of Finland, by the Finnish-Swedish writer Zacharias Topelius, died on the 15th of October, 1811. In 1756, the 7 Years' War, which lasted until 1763, broke out. In this war, which can also be called the First World War, all the major European powers fought on one side with Prussia and Great Britain, and on the other with the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, including Austria, France, and Russia. The map shows Great Britain, Prussia, and Portugal with their allies in blue, and France, Spain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden also with their allies in green. On the 18th of June 1757, in the Battle of Kolin between Prussian and Austrian forces, in which Prague, among other places, had been besieged, the troops of the Imperial Austrian field, Marshal Leopold Joseph Count of Daun, succeeded in overrunning Frederick's troops. In this battle, which was lost for Prussia, Keith was able to unite his regiments with Frederick II's army at Leitmeritz by means of a tactically skillful retreat from Prague. Just under 5 months later, in November 1757, Keith led the infantry in the Battle of Rossbach near Reichertsverben in the Electorate of Saxony, which was won by Prussia against the French and the Imperial Army of the Holy Roman Empire. After the Prussian army marched into Moravia in April 1758, their advance was repeatedly delayed by a late onset of winter. It was not until the end of May that the area around Olomouc was reached, which was now being besieged by Keith's army, with a strength of 11,000 men. However, since his forces were far too weak for this, there were repeated breakout battles with Austrian units, resulting in heavy losses on both sides. When a supply convoy of Frederick's, up to 40 kilometers long, was intercepted by Austrian troops, Old Fritz abandoned the siege and withdrew to Bohemia. And when Russian troops also marched in around mid-July, he had to evacuate Bohemia as well. Then, on the 25th of August, in scorching heat, the Battle of Zorndorf took place near Zorndorf, northeast of Küstrin and southeast of Königsberg in the Neumark, against the main Russian army under General Wilhelm Count von Fermor, who came from an English Baltic family. The battle ended in a Prussian victory, but with horrendous losses of up to 13,000 dead and wounded on the Prussian side, and around 18,000 on the Russian side. Keith had struggled with his poor health again in the summer and had withdrawn to his house to recuperate. but with the start of the autumn campaign, he was once again available to the army. Then came the 14th of October, 1758. The Imperial Austrian Count von Soudan had entrenched himself with 78,000 men and 340 cannons on the heights near the village of Hochkirch, 10 kilometers east of Bautzen. Friedrich II, who was preparing for the attack with his 30,000 soldiers and 200 cannons in the camp around Hochkirch, had only scorn for Daun. One would assume that the Caucasus, the Pico del Teide on Tenerife, or the Cordilleras are the home of Austrian generals because as soon as they see a mountain, they climb it. But Keith had pointed out to the king that it would be suicide to stay in the village. If the Austrians leave us alone in this camp, they deserve to be hanged. Friedrich had replied mockingly, "We must hope that they fear us more than they fear the gallows." Then everyone settled down to rest, so they would be fresh for the planned surprise attack on the Austrians. But Keith would be proven right. At 5 o'clock in the morning, still in complete darkness, Croatian pandours attacked the camp, surprising and overrunning the sleepy Prussian soldiers. The fact that Frederick's stubbornness in choosing the wrong camp did not lead to a greater catastrophe for the army was also thanks to the disobedience of his cavalry generals Hans Joachim von Zieten and Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz, who had insisted, contrary to the king's recommendations, that the horses of their regiments be left saddled even at night. In this battle, the Prussians lost around 9,000 men, including the 62-year-old Field Marshal Jakob von Keith. He had been shot several times, then a shot in the mouth killed him, and he fell into the arms of his groom, who had to leave Keith's body behind. When Austrian officers found the dead Prussian marshal on the battlefield the next day, he had been stripped of his clothes, but he was identified by Austrian Marshal Franz Moritz Graf von Lacy, the son of Keith's old commander in Russia, the aforementioned Peter Graf von Lacy, or Piotr Petrovich Lacy. Keith was then buried by the Austrians with a military funeral, after which his groom, who returned shortly afterwards, marked the spot. 6 months later, Frederick the Great had him transferred to the crypt of the garrison church in Berlin. Although this church was completely destroyed on the 23rd of November, 1943, after an Allied bombing raid, the crypt, in which 15 Prussian field marshals and about 50 generals, among others, had been buried between 1722 and 1830, remained undamaged, but it was looted several times after the war. Then in 1949, at the instigation of the Soviet military administration, the remaining remains of the dead from 199 coffins that were still available at that time were collected in 47 coffins, taken to the Stahnsdorf Southwest Cemetery, and buried there in the Epiphany block. It is marked with a cross and a weathered stone with the inscription, "Here lie the dead, from 2 centuries from the old garrison church in Berlin, 1949. The ruins of the Berlin garrison church, of which only the outer walls remained standing up to the eaves, were demolished in 1962. In 1769, Friedrich II, along with other Prussian generals, also erected a monument to his friend and comrade Keith on Berlin's Wilhelmplatz, which was completely destroyed in the Second World War. Thanks to timely relocation in 1943, all the monuments that stood there survived. Today they are located on Zietenplatz in Berlin's Mitte district. Among them is also the monument to the distinguished Prussian Field Marshal Jakob von Keith.